A single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, pushed under a steel door at 4 in the morning while the town slept and the frost still held the grass down flat. You don't know her name yet. You don't know what it cost her to walk up that gravel lot, past the row of parked motorcycles gleaming dull under a security light, and leave that paper there instead of knocking. But by the end of this, you will understand why 47 men chose a stranger's kitchen table over their own Sunday, and why the last thing she says to them, standing on a porch that's about to stop being hers, will stay with you long after you've closed this tab. Stay till the end. Tell us what town you're watching from. The clubhouse door was a slab of cold steel, patched with a hand-painted wing on one side, and it opened that morning onto nothing. No visitor, no truck idling in the lot, just a single folded sheet resting against the threshold, like it had always been there, like the wind had placed it, and not a person. He found it first. He always found things first. 31 years of habit does that to a man, the habit of noticing what's out of place before he understands why it matters. He'd built that habit in places with names he didn't say out loud anymore, in years that had left him with a limp in cold weather, and a silence he wore like the leather on his back. He picked the paper up before the others were awake, before the coffee had finished dripping in the kitchen behind him, and he unfolded it standing in the doorway with the November air still sharp enough to bite through a flannel shirt. Bank letterhead. Regional office, Black Ridge Branch. A name at the top, Voss. That meant nothing to him yet, and a date stamped in the corner that would mean everything in 9 days. Notice of accelerated foreclosure, it said, in the kind of language built to be skimmed past by tired eyes. Response window, 21 days from date of issue. He did the math without meaning to. 12 days had already burned off somewhere between a mailbox and a folded sheet of paper left outside a door instead of knocked on. There was no note. No name signed at the bottom, no explanation for why a stranger's business had ended up on their step instead of a lawyer's desk or a kitchen table somewhere across town. Just the paper, and the frost, and the tire tracks in the gravel that belonged to a truck none of them recognized, already gone by the time anyone thought to look. He stood there a long moment, reading the name at the top again. Voss. He knew that name. Not from the bank, not from the county, but from somewhere further back. A cedar box in his mother's closet. A letter he hadn't read since she died. Ink gone the color of weak tea. He folded the paper the way it had been folded, and he went back inside to find out why. The clubhouse at that hour still smelled of last night's fire, ash gone cold in the barrel stove, and the long table where they ate and argued and sometimes bled was empty except for a coffee cup someone had left, ringed with a brown stain. He set the folded notice down on the wood, smoothing it flat with the side of his hand, the way a man smooths a bandage over something that still hurts underneath. He did not call a meeting, not yet. He went instead to the back room he kept locked, the one none of the others asked about because in 19 years none of them ever had to. A cot, a footlocker. On top of the footlocker, a cedar box the size of a boot, its hinges gone stiff with disuse, the wood dark with the oil of hands that had opened it 1,000 times before his. He knew what was inside before he lifted the lid. He always knew. That was the trouble with boxes like this. They never surprised you, they only confirmed what you already carried. The letter was near the bottom, beneath a rosary and a photograph of a man in uniform who was not him, and beneath a ribbon from a county fair his mother had never once mentioned winning. The paper had softened with age, gone the texture of cloth. Her handwriting slanted hard to the right, urgent even at rest. The ink faded to the color of weak tea just as he remembered. Dear Ruth. It began. Not to him. To some woman named Ruth he had never heard of. A letter never sent, or sent and returned, or never finished. There was no way to know now, and the not knowing had never bothered him before tonight. You would not believe the woman out on the old dairy road. His mother had written, feeding half the Mill families off her porch since Sanders shut the line down. Nobody asked her to. She just does it, plate after plate, like she's got more than the rest of us, though God knows she doesn't. Her name is Marlene Voss, and I think this town owes her more than it will ever pay back. He read it twice. Then a third time, slower, the way a man rereads a verdict. 1974. 50 years, near enough, between that porch and this notice, between a woman feeding strangers and a woman folding her own ruin under a stranger's door, because she could not bring herself to ask for anything at all. He sat on the edge of the cot a long while, the letter loose in his hand, the box open beside him, and outside the window the sky had gone the pale gray of a morning that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it meant to be. 9 days, the notice had said. He folded the letter back along its old creases, set it inside his jacket instead of the box, and went to find the men who would need to hear this before the coffee finished burning. The clubhouse kitchen smelled of scorched coffee and cigarette smoke gone stale overnight, and the men who gathered there did not sit so much as arrange themselves, the way men do when they sense something is coming that will require their attention in full. He did not raise his voice. He never did. He set the folded foreclosure notice on the table beside his mother's letter, the two papers touching at the corner like they belonged to the same conversation, and he let the room read them both in silence before he said anything at all. 9 days, someone said finally, more statement than question. He nodded. The youngest patched member, the one who still had the look of a boy playing dress-up in his father's cut, though nobody said that to his face, leaned over the table and read the letter twice, his mouth moving faintly on the second pass. He looked up. 50 years, he said. That's not a coincidence. That's a debt. Nobody argued with him. The sergeant-at-arms, a wide, quiet man whose knuckles had been broken and reset so many times they no longer closed all the way into a fist, turned the bank notice over like he expected something different on the back. 21-day window, he read aloud. Filed 12 days ago. He looked up at the room, not at the president. That's not standard timing. That's rushed. He said it the way a man says something he has seen before and did not like the first time either. The president told them, in the fewest words, the story aloud, what the letter said and who had written it, and what his mother had meant 50 years before this cold coffee morning, when she'd sat on some other porch and watched an 18-year-old widow feed other people's hungry children off her own table, because the alternative was watching them go without in front of her. He did not editorialize, he let the numbers do the arguing. 36 years alone on that land, 40 cows left of 200, one folded piece of paper slid under a stranger's door because a woman would rather lose everything quietly than ask for help out loud. The youngest one asked the question the room was circling. Why us? Why not the bank, the county, anybody whose job this actually is? The president looked at him for a long moment, and something in his face made the boy stop expecting an easy answer. Because it already tried them, he said, and it lost. Outside, the sun had begun to commit to the day, burning the gray off the sky in slow degrees, the parking lot gravel throwing back a white glare that promised heat by noon. He folded the notice back into his jacket alongside the letter, two documents 50 years apart now traveling together, and told the room to eat something and be ready within the hour. Nobody asked ready for what. They already understood, the way men understand weather changing before the first drop falls, that whatever came next would not be small, and that the woman on that porch had no idea 47 strangers were about to learn her name. The clubhouse kitchen smelled of burnt coffee and bacon grease, and the men ate standing up, plates balanced on forearms tattooed with dates, and names of places most of them tried not to remember out loud. He did not eat. He stood by the window with the two folded papers still against his chest, as if the letter needed a witness before it could be filed away for later, and watched the lot fill with machines coughing to life one at a time, throats clearing after a long night's silence. He went back to the letter once more before he put it down. His mother's handwriting slanted hard to the right, the ink gone the color of weak tea, and she had written the widow's name twice on the same page, once in the middle of a sentence and once alone on its own line, underlined, as though even in 1974 she understood that some names needed to be set apart from the rest so they would not get lost in the accounting of an ordinary year. Voss. He said it under his breath, testing the shape of it, and it fit some old groove in him he hadn't known was empty. The sergeant-at-arms found him there, boots planted, arms crossed, watching the lot. You want to tell me what this is really about, he said. Not the farm. You. The president did not answer right away. Outside, someone kicked a bike upright and the engine caught on the second try, settling into that low idle that felt less like sound than like something felt through the floor of the boots. My mother fed people she didn't know, he said finally. During the shutdown, woman on a porch with a coffee pot and no more money than the men she was feeding. I never understood why she kept talking about it until I was older than she was when she died. And now there's a woman on a porch again, he said. Same kind, different decade. The sergeant-at-arms nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he isn't agreeing so much as filing the reasoning away for use later, and asked the practical question that needed asking before anything else could move forward. Does she know we're coming? No. Does she want us coming? The president finally turned from the window, and something in his face had gone flat and certain, the look of a man who has already made peace with the fact that permission was never going to be granted in words, only in the not turning away of an old woman on a porch when 47 engines rolled up her gravel drive. She'll want it once she sees it's not charity, he said. What is it then? Overdue, he said, and folded the two papers together one final time. 50 years pressed flat against 9 days, and walked out into the white morning glare to give the order that would put tires on the road toward Voss Dairy before the coffee in the pot had even gone cold. The order did not sound like an order. It sounded like a man reading a grocery list to a room that already knew what it needed. Fuel, chainsaws, the trailer with the lumber still strapped from a job that had fallen through in March. Somebody call the woman who does titles for a living, he said, and the sergeant-at-arms's jaw tightened at that, the particular way a man's jaw tightens when his wife is about to be volunteered for something in front of 40 men before he's had the chance to ask her himself. She'll say yes, the sergeant-at-arms said. She always says yes to the ones that can't pay. That's the only kind worth taking, the president said. By 8:40, the lot behind the clubhouse had gone from gravel and shadow to a churn of exhaust and boots, men pulling gear from lockers that hadn't been opened since the last funeral run, checking chains and mirrors with the automatic hands of people who have done this so many times, the body no longer consults the mind. Nobody asked why. That was its own kind of answer. In 19 years of patches and votes and slow Tuesday meetings that ran long on nothing, the club had learned that the president's why usually arrived late, if it arrived in the paperwork at all, and that the asking of it before a ride only cost daylight. The letter went back into the cedar box, and the box went under his arm, not the saddlebag, the way a man carries something he intends to still have at the end of the day. He found the youngest patched member crouched by his bike, feeding a stray barn cat that had wandered up from somewhere near the fence line months ago and simply never left, the way strays do when they decide a place is theirs before anyone else has agreed to it. You know dairy work? The president asked. I know how to not be in the way, the youngest said, which was true enough that the president let it stand. They rode out in a formation that had no ceremony to it, 47 machines finding their spacing the way water finds a slope, and the highway out of town unrolled flat and heat-shimmered toward the county line, past the shuttered feed store and the church with half its letters missing from the marquee, past fields gone to seed because the men who once worked them were either dead or too old or had moved to towns that still had jobs in them. The president rode at the front with the box wedged against his tank bag and the folded foreclosure papers in his jacket, 9 days pressing down on him like a hand between the shoulder blades, and somewhere behind the 40th bike, or the 45th, nobody counting exactly, the youngest patched member rode with one hand loose on the throttle, already wondering, without knowing why the thought arrived, what an old woman does with her mornings when there is no longer anyone left to milk the cows beside her. The farm announced itself before the sign did, a line of fence posts leaning like old men at a funeral, the wire between them sagging in long silver arcs, and then the barn itself, red gone to rust brown, its roofline dipping in the middle, the way a spine dips under years of carrying weight it wasn't built for. The hand-painted sign came last, Voss Dairy, EST, 1951. The paint chipped down to bare wood in the shape of old rain, and the president slowed his bike without deciding to, the way a man slows walking past a grave he didn't know he was looking for. She was on the porch when they came up the drive, not surprised. Not moving to hide or to greet, she stood the way a fence post stands, because standing was simply the thing being done at that hour, and she watched 47 motorcycles fill a yard that had not held more than one truck at a time in years, and she did not speak until the engines went quiet, and the dust settled, and the quiet after was its own kind of loud. "You didn't have to come all this way," she said. The president swung his leg off the bike slow, his knees telling him about it, and he held up the folded papers like a man presenting evidence in a case that hadn't yet gone to trial. 9 days, ma'am, he said. She looked at the papers the way a person looks at a photograph of themselves taken without permission, recognition and reluctance both. "My son shouldn't have done that," she said. "He didn't do anything wrong," the president said. "He just didn't know who else to trust it to." She didn't answer that. Her eyes moved instead over the men dismounting, over the leather and the ink and the gray in the beards, cataloging them the way she must have once cataloged weather fronts and feed prices, deciding what kind of trouble had arrived and whether it was the kind that left a mess behind it. Somewhere behind the barn, a cat came out low along the fence line, orange and thin, and she turned her head toward it before she turned back, and that small unconscious motion told the youngest patched member more than anything she'd said aloud. "There's cats to feed," she said, like it explained something, like it excused her for not offering coffee, and she went down the porch steps one at a time, gripping the rail, and crossed the yard toward the barn without looking back to see if any of them followed. The president watched her go, and did not move yet. Behind him he heard boots hitting gravel. 46 men working out without instruction, who among them knew how to make themselves useful, and who would need telling, and he thought of a name in a cedar box, a woman 36 years alone in a house built for a marriage, and he thought, not for the first time that morning, that 9 days was going to feel like nothing at all. The cat let her come within 3 feet before it sat down hard in the dirt and waited, the way an animal waits when it has learned exactly how long a person takes to open a bag of feed. She kept a coffee can just inside the barn door, dented on one side, and she scooped from it without measuring, the way someone does a task they've done 10,000 times, and the cat ate while she stood over it with her arms crossed against the cold that still hadn't burned off the morning. The youngest patched member had followed at a distance he hoped looked like nothing, hands in his jacket pockets, and he stopped at the barn door and did not go in. "There's more of them," she said, not looking up. 4, 5, they come and go. He asked if she fed all of them. "Somebody has to," she said, and screwed the lid back onto the can, and for a moment that was the whole of it, a woman and a cat and a rectangle of morning light falling through the doorway onto old straw, and he understood he was watching something that had been happening in this exact spot for longer than he'd been alive, some version of it, some earlier cat, some earlier morning. Behind her, deeper in the barn, 40 cows stood in stanchions built for 200, the empty ones gone gray with disuse, and the smell was less than it should have been, less milk and manure and heat than a working dairy barn ought to carry, and he understood that too. Not a farm exactly anymore, but the shape of one, held together by a woman doing what a woman does when quitting, has never once occurred to her as an option worth considering. She noticed him noticing. "Wasn't always like this," she said. "Had 200 once. Had Harold." She said the name the way people say names they've said so many times alone, that the saying has worn smooth, no catch in it, no performance of grief, just a fact laid down like a fence post. "He milked that side," she said, and nodded toward the far end of the barn without looking at it, "and he died right about there, and there was nothing after that but the sound of the cat finishing its food and walking off satisfied into the shadows between the stalls." Outside, hammering had started on the roofline, the first sheet of new tin going up, and the sound carried into the barn thin and metallic, and she flinched at it, just barely, a small correction of the shoulders, and he thought she was listening for something under the noise, for the sound of it going wrong, of help costing her something she couldn't yet see the price of. "I don't need charity," she said, "to no one, to the cat, to the space where her husband used to stand." "No, ma'am," he said, "nobody's calling it that." She looked at him then, really looked, the first time she had, and whatever she found in his face she filed away without comment, and turned back toward the house, boots dragging faint lines through the dust, leaving him standing in the doorway with the smell of old hay and the sound of 46 men deciding, board by board, what this place still owed the world. He walked the fence line that afternoon with the youngest patched member, the two of them counting posts the way a man counts ribs on something wounded, looking for what could be saved and what had to be pulled and replaced. 40 of the 200 fence posts Harold Voss had sunk in 1962 were still standing true, silvered and hard as iron, and the younger man ran his palm along one of them like it was scripture. "She dug these herself," he said, not a question. The president nodded. "Said she used to hold the level while her husband drove them, back when there were 200 cows and a hired man besides. Now there were 40 cows and no hired man, and a woman who woke at 4:30, out of habit rather than necessity, because the body remembers what the mind has stopped requiring." They found the milking parlor next, and it took the better part of an hour just to understand what they were looking at. A stainless steel system built for 200 head, most of the lines dry-rotted, one working unit dragged forward to serve 40 cows one at a time, twice a day, by a woman whose hands had begun to shake around the same year the size of the herd had. The president crouched by the compressor and found the manufacture date stamped in the metal, 1979. Older than the youngest man crouched beside him by better than 2 decades. "This still runs," the young one said, surprised. "Everything here still runs," the president said. "That's the whole trouble with it." By evening, the barn had a partial roof again, new tin catching the last orange light and throwing it back gold across the yard, and somewhere past the tree line, a generator someone had trailered in was charging a bank of tools for tomorrow. Marlene came out onto the porch once, in the blue hour, and stood with her arms folded across her cardigan, watching 47 men she had not invited move around her property with a purpose she had not asked for, and she did not come down the steps, and she did not go back inside either. The cat wound once around her ankles and she bent, slow, joints audible even from a distance, and scratched behind its ears without looking down, her eyes still on the barn. The president found the letter again that night, back at the clubhouse, unfolded on the desk where he'd left it, his mother's handwriting gone soft at the creases from being read too many times in 1 week. He read the line again, the one about porches and hungry children, and a woman who never once asked to be repaid, and then he picked up the phone and called the lawyer, because there was a second name in that letter he hadn't looked at closely enough yet, a name signed at the bottom of a bank document Marlene had shown him without meaning to, and it wasn't a name that belonged to a stranger. The lawyer answered on the second ring, wide awake, though it was past 11, because she'd learned by now that phone calls from the clubhouse rarely waited for morning. He read her the name off the document Marlene had shown him 3 days back without meaning to. Just handed it over, folded once, the way she handed over most things now, like she expected it to be taken from her regardless. The lawyer went quiet on the line for long enough that he asked if she was still there. She was. She was just writing something down. The name belonged to a man 2 generations removed from the one signing foreclosure paperwork out of the Black Ridge branch now, but it was the same family, the same ink going back further than either of them had thought to look. His mother's letter had named the mill that shut its doors in 1974 and put half the county out of work inside a season. The mill had an owner. The owner had a son. The son, it turned out, had a son of his own, who now sat behind a desk with a bank's name on the glass door, deciding which widows got 21 days and which got none, deciding it quietly, in a font no different from any other font, on paper that looked like every other piece of paper that had ever come through a mail slot. Coincidence, maybe. The lawyer didn't believe in those, not in a town the size of Black Ridge, where the same 6 or 7 surnames had been trading the same 100 acres back and forth for 100 years. She told him to bring her the deed history in the morning, the original mortgage, anything with a date on it going back before Harold. She told him this in the flat, unhurried voice she used when she already knew what she was going to find, and was only waiting for the paperwork to agree with her. He sat at the desk a long while after he hung up, the letter still open under the desk lamp, his mother's handwriting steady and sure in a way his own never had been. 6 days left on the notice now. 6 days, and a barn roof half finished, and 40 cows that still needed milking twice a day whether or not anyone in town cared how the money got made to keep them fed. Outside, someone had left the shop light burning over by the equipment they were still coaxing back to life, a single bulb in a wire cage throwing long shadows across the gravel, and under it, the youngest patched member crouched with a socket wrench and the milking machine's compressor pulled half apart on a tarp, chasing a noise he did not like the sound of. He had been out there since supper. He would be out there past midnight. That was the thing about him that the others had started to notice without saying it aloud. He did not treat the work like a favor he was doing. He treated it like a debt he owed and hadn't finished paying. The president found him there, wrench in hand, grease to the elbow, the barn cat circling his ankles in the cone of light because she still fed them at 6, and they had learned to expect it from whoever was closest. "She know you're out here. She brought me coffee an hour ago." He didn't look up. "Told me Harold used to say a machine will tell you what's wrong with it if you're patient enough to let it finish talking." The president crouched beside him, picked up a fitting, turned it over in his hand, the way a man turns over a fact he isn't ready to accept yet. 6 days. He kept doing the arithmetic without meaning to, the way you check a wound you already know is bad. Lawyer wants deed history tomorrow, everything before Harold. The kid's hands stilled on the compressor casing. She thinks it goes back further than the bank. She thinks nothing's a coincidence in a town this size. Somewhere past the tree line, a dog was barking at something only it could hear, and the wind had shifted, carrying the smell of the pasture grass gone dry and gold at the edges, the particular hush of late August, in a place where the heat doesn't break so much as get tired. The farmhouse light was still on. It was always still on, longer than it should have been for a woman her age who claimed she slept fine. "She won't ask what we find," the kid said, "even if it's bad. She'll just want to know if the cows get fed tomorrow." The president said nothing to that, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound smaller than the truth. He thought of his mother's letter folded in his jacket pocket, 36 years old and still warm somehow, still doing work in the world it had no right to still be doing. He thought about a widow feeding strangers off a porch during a shutdown nobody in Black Ridge liked to talk about anymore, and a different widow, decades later, doing the same math with the same stubborn arithmetic. Feed what's in front of you first, worry about the rest after. The compressor coughed, caught, ran rough, then smoothed out into something almost like the sound it was supposed to make. Neither of them smiled, but the kid exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath for longer than one machine's worth of trouble, and reached for the next fitting. By noon the compressor held steady, and the milking parlor smelled of machine oil and old concrete dust, a smell that had probably not changed since the year the parlor was poured. The president stood in the doorway and watched 40 gallons of nothing move through lines built for 200, and understood, in a way that arithmetic alone couldn't teach him, how much had been lost here 1 cow at a time, 1 year at a time, until loss became the only steady thing on the property. She came in around 1, with a coffee can of nails, and did not ask how the machine sounded. She listened to it the way a mother listens to a child's breathing in another room, without turning her head, filing the sound away as either fine or not fine, and moving on to the next task before the verdict was even fully formed. "Harold used to say a compressor tells you everything," she said, setting the can on a shelf worn pale by 40 years of the same hand reaching for it. "Tells you if the belts are going. Tells you if somebody's been neglecting it. Tells you the truth before the milk does." She looked at the kid, who was still on his knees by the fitting. "You listen good," she said. It was not quite a compliment. It was closer to an assessment, the kind she might have once given a hired hand worth keeping. Outside, the sound of hammers had settled into something rhythmic, 3 men on the barn roof working in a cadence that didn't need words, and somewhere past the fence line, a chainsaw started and started again, clearing deadfall from a hayfield that hadn't been properly cut in longer than anyone wanted to say aloud. The president counted heads without meaning to, an old habit from another life, another kind of head count, one that used to matter for different reasons. 40-some men on 9 acres of failing ground, and not one of them asking her for anything back. She went to check the cats before she left the parlor. 4 bowls in a row by the barn door, filled that morning, filled every morning, rain or ice or grief. The kid watched her do it and said nothing, which the president had come to understand was the kid's particular gift, knowing when a silence belonged to someone else. That evening, back at the clubhouse, the lawyer called with a date. Not the auction date, a different date, sooner, smaller, easier to miss if you weren't looking for it. The date the bank's own internal records would have to be filed, showing exactly when the accelerated notice was authorized and by whom. She said it like she'd found a loose thread on a coat that looked, from a distance, sewn shut. The president asked her what that meant, and the lawyer said it the way people say things they've learned not to promise before they're sure. Carefully, with room left around the edges. It meant, she said, that somewhere in a filing cabinet or a server in a regional office 2 counties over, there was a signature, a date, a name attached to the decision to shrink a 21-day window down to 9, on a piece of land worth nothing to anyone except the 81-year-old woman who'd worked it and the men now quietly rebuilding her fences. If the signature belonged to the same officer who'd been buying up parcels along the county line under 3 different shell names, that wasn't a coincidence anymore. That was a pattern. And patterns, she said, were the only thing that moved faster than money in this state. Because a pattern was a story, and a story could run in a newspaper before a lawyer could ever get it in front of a judge. The president sat with the phone against his ear for a long moment after she'd said her piece, looking out the clubhouse window at the dark shapes of trucks and trailers parked in a crooked row, borrowed lumber stacked under tarps that smelled of pine and rain. He thought about the cedar box still sitting on the table where he'd left it, the letter folded back into its envelope, his mother's handwriting steady and small even at the edges where the paper had softened with age. 40 years between 2 women who'd never once met, and somehow the same thin sentence connecting them, that someone had been left standing at a door nobody opened. He asked the lawyer what she needed. She said time, mostly. And someone at the courthouse in Black Ridge willing to pull records without asking too many questions about why. He said he knew a man like that, a prospect 2 years patched in, whose sister filed paperwork for the county clerk and owed him a favor from a winter he didn't like to talk about. Outside, past the window, the kid's motorcycle sat cooling in the gravel, and somewhere down the dark road the farmhouse porch light would still be burning, because Marlene left it on for cats that came and went at their own hours, the way she'd left it on every night for 36 years for a husband who never came home from the parlor again. The president closed the cedar box, set his hand flat against the lid, and told the lawyer to make the calls she needed to make. 9 days had become 7. Somewhere in that shrinking window, a name was waiting to be found. The prospect's sister worked on the 2nd floor of the county building, in a records room that smelled of toner and old paper, and she pulled the deed history on Voss Dairy the way a person pulls a splinter, quick, and without looking too closely at what came out with it. 7 parcels, not 1, 7, filed over 4 years, each with the same accelerated language buried on page 3, each notarized by the same bank officer, each time to expire in the dead stretch between planting and harvest when an old farmer's mind was on something other than paperwork. The lawyer laid the printouts across the president's kitchen table like a hand of cards nobody wanted to have dealt them. Wood Building on Route 9. The Hollis place, sold at auction 11 months back for $4,000 under assessed value. A dairy outside Cutter's Fork, gone quiet the same spring its owner turned 82. He's not doing anything to her that he hasn't already done 6 times, she said. The president studied the names. Some he recognized from church suppers decades gone, from feed store counters, from funerals his mother had dragged him to as a boy in a collar too tight for his neck. Old names, names that belonged to people who still believed a signature meant something sacred, that a bank was an institution and not a hunting ground. He thought about the letter in the cedar box, the handwriting gone soft at the edges, his mother's voice describing a porch light, and a woman who fed strangers, because feeding strangers was simply what you did, when the alternative was watching them starve in a ditch by the road. 40 years later, somebody had built a whole quiet business out of forgetting that. "Can you use this?" he asked. "I can use this," she said, "but not yet. Not until we know it's airtight. If we go loud too early," he buries the paper trail and files new dates. Right now, he doesn't know we've seen his hand. Outside, the temperature had dropped with the sun, and somewhere on the ridge, a dog was barking at nothing, the sound carrying flat and lonesome across the dark fields, the way sound does in country this empty. The kid was already gone, back out toward the farm to check the cats, to check the light on the porch, though nobody had told him to keep doing that. He just kept doing it. The president folded the printouts and slid them into the cedar box beside the letter, 2 documents 40 years apart, one about a debt of kindness and one about a debt collected without mercy, and it struck him that both were about the same thing in the end: who gets remembered and who gets left standing at a door. 6 days remained. Somewhere in Black Ridge, a man was signing more paper, certain no one was watching. The barn roof went up on the 6th morning like a promise, being kept in front of witnesses. 40 men on ladders and scaffolds, hammers going in a ragged, overlapping rhythm that had no music in it and still sounded like something being built rather than torn down. The kid was on the ground crew, hauling shingles, and every hour or so he'd stop and look up at the farmhouse window where she stood, apron on, watching them work like she still didn't quite believe it wasn't a dream she'd wake from disappointed. She brought out lemonade in a pitcher that had a hairline crack down one side, sealed years ago, with something that looked like candle wax, and nobody said anything about the crack. They drank from jars because the glasses had run out at 20, and the taste of it, too much sugar, not enough ice, was the kind of thing men would remember years later, without knowing why. The lawyer arrived a little after noon in a gray sedan that looked wrong on the gravel, dust settling into its clean paint like an insult, and she carried a folder thick enough to need both hands. She sat with Marlene at the kitchen table where Harold's chair still waited, unmoved, and she spoke slowly, the way you speak to someone you don't want to frighten with good news. "The notice has a defect," she said. "Small, but it's there." He filed the accelerated clause under a code meant for commercial property. "Your farm's zoned residential agricultural. It might be enough." "Might," Marlene repeated. "I want more than might," the lawyer said. "I want the paper trail on the other properties. If he's done this more than once, it's not a mistake. It's a pattern. Patterns are what juries remember." Outside, the president stood at the fence line with his arms crossed, watching the roof crew work against a sky that had gone the color of a healing bruise, purple-gray at the edges, and he thought about the 6 days left folding down toward 5, the way a hand closes slow around something it means to keep. The kid came and stood beside him without being asked, the way he'd started doing all week, and after a while he said, "She still puts the boots by the door every night, even with all this going on." "I noticed." "Why, you figure?" The president didn't answer right away. Down at the barn, one of the older members had stopped hammering to wipe his face with a rag, and for a moment the whole crew seemed to hold still in the heat, 40 men suspended in the same breath. "Because some things you keep doing," the president said finally, "even after the reason for doing them is gone. That's not sadness. That's just what love looks like when it's had 36 years to get quiet." The kid nodded like he was filing that away somewhere he'd need it later, and neither of them spoke again until the sun dropped low enough to turn the barn's new tin roof to fire, and somewhere behind them, in the kitchen, the lawyer was already dialing a number in Black Ridge she had been saving for exactly the right moment. The lawyer stood at the kitchen counter with the receiver pressed to her ear and her free hand flat against the wood, as if steadying herself against something that hadn't happened yet. She had written the number on the back of an envelope 3 days earlier and looked at it every night since, the way a person looks at a locked door before deciding to knock. Now she dialed it. The line rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, tired and clipped, the voice of someone who fielded calls all day and had learned to sound busy even when she wasn't. Black Ridge Courier. "I need to speak with whoever handles county land and foreclosure filings." There was a pause, papers shuffling, a chair creaking somewhere in a newsroom that smelled, she imagined, of burnt coffee and old carpet. Then a man's voice, younger, careful. "That'd be me. Can I ask what this is regarding?" She looked out the window while she answered. The president and the kid were still out by the corral, 2 shapes going soft at the edges in the last light, and beyond them, the barn's new roof held the sun like it was trying to give something back. She thought of the folded notice that had started all of it, the 9 days that were now down to 5, the accelerated filings she'd found buried under 3 other elderly names in the county recorder's office that afternoon: Delacroix, Hutto, Prine. Parcels strung along the same half-mile of county road, like beads on a wire nobody was supposed to notice. A pattern, she said. Foreclosures timed to expire before the owners can respond. All of them over 70. All of them within a mile of a development parcel filed under a shell name last spring. The reporter didn't say anything for a moment, and she let him have the silence, the way she'd learned to in depositions, because silence was where people decided how much they wanted to know. You have documentation? I have 4 case files and a woman who's about to lose 40 years of her life over a paperwork clock nobody explained to her in plain English. When can I see it? Day 7, she said. Come to the farm, bring a camera. She hung up before he could ask why a farm, why bikers, why any of it. Because that part wasn't a phone call. That part was something you had to stand in the dirt to understand. The way the men out there understood it now, hammering and stringing wire in 90-degree heat for a woman who owed them nothing and had asked them for less than that. Outside, the light had gone the color of a struck match, and the president was still standing where she'd left him, watching the barn like it might tell him something new if he waited long enough. The barn didn't tell him anything new. It never did. It just stood there the way it had for 73 years, red paint gone to rust-colored memory in patches, roofline straighter now than it had been 9 days ago, and he had learned enough about buildings and men to know that both of them held their secrets the same way, in the places nobody thought to look, the joints and the seams, the parts too small to photograph. He walked the fence line instead, because his knees didn't like standing still, and because walking had always been how he thought. 40 yards out, the youngest patched member was crouched by the old cistern, running his thumb along a crack in the concrete cap, and when he heard boots in the gravel, he didn't look up. She comes out here at 4, he said. Every day, doesn't feed anything, just stands here a minute. The president looked at the cistern, then at the farmhouse, lit gold now with the low sun, and said nothing, because he'd learned that too, that some observations didn't need an answer, just a witness. I asked her about it, the younger man said. She said Harold used to check the water level here every evening before supper, said the cows would tell you if something was wrong before the gauge would. And now? Now she just stands here. I don't think it's about the water. The president crouched, because his body still remembered how, even if it complained about it after, and looked at the crack the boy had been tracing, hairline, old, patched once with something that had long since crumbled out. Fix it, he said. It's not on the list. Put it on the list. The younger man nodded, like he'd been waiting for permission to say something, and now didn't need to. Above them, the sky had gone the deep bruised orange that came before the light quit entirely, and somewhere behind the house a screen door opened and shut, soft, the sound of someone checking that things were where they should be before dark. 2 barn cats came out from under the porch at the sound, unhurried, certain, and sat by the steps the way they must have sat for years, waiting on a schedule only they and she understood. The president watched them a moment, then looked back at the crack in the cistern cap, small and old and easy to miss, and understood without being told that it was one of 40 such things on this farm, worn places nobody had replaced, because replacing them meant admitting somebody wasn't coming back to notice if they were fixed or not. 7 days, the younger man said, not really a question. 7 days, the president said, and stood, and looked toward the house where the light had just come on in the kitchen window, small and yellow against the dying orange sky, and did not yet know what the reporter would find when he came, only that the farm would still be standing to show him. The kitchen light stayed on longer than it should have for a woman who lived alone, and had no reason to be up past 9. The president noticed it the way he noticed most things now, without comment, filing it beside the cracked cistern cap, and the leaning fence post, and the 40 small wounds this place had learned to live with. He walked the porch line once more before turning in, checking the boards the way he'd check a perimeter, out of habit more than need, and found her sitting at the kitchen table through the window, not moving, a single lamp burning over a stack of papers she'd already folded twice. He didn't go in. Some things a man let a woman keep to herself, even when he'd already seen the shape of what she was hiding. In the morning, the crew split without needing to be told. 4 men went up the barn roof with tar paper and nail guns, their boots finding the old rafters like they'd walked them before. 2 more crawled under the milking parlor with flashlights clenched in their teeth, tracing wire that hadn't carried current since the Reagan administration. The lawyer's voice carried faint and steady from the porch, phone pressed to her ear, reciting statute numbers to someone at the county clerk's office like she was reading a grocery list, patient, unbothered, the kind of patient that came from knowing exactly how this particular fight got won. The younger man found the boots again that afternoon, still by the door, still waiting on a man who'd been gone 36 years, and this time he didn't ask about them. He simply moved them 6 inches to the left, out of the mud track the crew had worn coming and going, and set them back exactly square, the way a man does with something he understands is not his to touch but is his to protect. Marlene came out around 4 with a pitcher of water sweating in the heat and stood watching the roofline a long moment before she spoke. Harold always said that Roof would outlive him, she said. Guess he wasn't wrong, just didn't say by how long. Nobody answered that. There wasn't an answer that wouldn't have cheapened it. By evening, the barn had a new skin of tar paper gleaming faintly in the last light, and the smell of it, hot tar, cut wood, machine oil, sat over the yard like something being built instead of something being lost. The president stood at the fence line counting cows out of habit, 40 of them moving slow toward the barn in the blue dusk, and did the arithmetic he'd been avoiding all week. 6 days left, a reporter coming, a bank officer somewhere in town who did not yet know his name, was about to be printed. He looked toward the house once more. The kitchen light was off now, but the porch light was on, small and steady, left burning for men who hadn't asked her to leave it. On the 6th morning, the lawyer arrived without her husband, driving her own truck up the gravel with a accordion folder on the passenger seat thick enough to need a rubber band around it. She did not go to the barn. She went to the kitchen table, where Marlene had already set out 2 cups without being asked, and she laid the folder open like a hand of cards nobody wanted to fold. I pulled every filing the bank's made in this county in the last 14 months, she said. 11 of them look like yours. Same accelerated language, same 9-day math built into a 21-day notice, if you know when the clock actually starts. Marlene turned one of the pages toward herself, reading with her finger under the words the way she must have done since she was young, though her eyes didn't need the help any more than her memory did. 11 old folks, she said. 11 parcels, the lawyer said. All of them touching, if you look at a map. All of them going to the same holding company, 2 months after the notices went out. The president stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, having come in for water, and stayed for something else entirely. He watched Marlene's face for the anger he expected, and did not find it. Found instead something quieter and older, a woman doing sums she'd done before, in leaner years, about who got fed and who didn't. He's not just after my 40 acres, she said. No, ma'am, the lawyer said. You're the 9th domino, not the 1st. Nobody said the reporter's name out loud, but it sat in the room anyway, waiting on the 7th day like a guest already expected. The lawyer gathered her folder, careful with it as scripture, and said she'd have affidavits from 2 of the other landowners by morning, if their hands weren't too proud to sign them. Prouder than mine, Marlene said, and that's saying something. Outside, the milking equipment coughed twice and caught, and somewhere past the fence line, a man laughed low at something another man said, the first real laughter the yard had heard all week, and it moved through the kitchen window like weather changing. The president set his hat back on and went out into it, into the 6 days that were now 5, into the smell of diesel and cut hay, and the barn's new tar paper skin holding the evening heat a little longer than it should. He did not know yet what the reporter would ask, or what the bank officer would say, when his name showed up in print beside 11 others he had never expected anyone to count. He knew only that the porch light was already burning again, though the sun hadn't fully gone, as if Marlene Voss had stopped waiting for dark to trust that someone was still coming. The reporter came on the 7th day, as arranged, a young woman with a county car, that had a dent in the fender, and a notebook already half full from other stories that hadn't mattered as much as this one would. She parked where the gravel widened, careful not to block the equipment trailer, and stood a moment looking at the barn's new roof. The fence line straightened, the sign repainted so the black letters of Voss Dairy, EST, 1951, stood sharp again against whiteboard for the first time in years. She wrote something down before she'd even reached the porch steps. Marlene met her at the door in a clean house dress, her hair pinned the way it must have been pinned for church decades ago, and offered coffee before the woman could ask a single question. That was how it went, in this house. Hospitality first, grief second, and everything else after that if there was time. The president stayed back near the barn while the reporter worked, because he understood that some stories needed to be told by the person who'd lived them, not the men who'd shown up 9 days in. He watched instead. He watched the youngest patched member carry 2 chairs onto the porch so the women wouldn't have to sit on the steps, watched him set a saucer of milk down for the barn cats without being asked. The same unthinking care Marlene herself performed 100 times a day, and no one else had thought worth noticing until now. Inside, the reporter asked about the notice. Marlene answered plainly, no bitterness in it, only fact. The date, the window, the son who'd found it too heavy to bring to her directly. She did not excuse him and did not condemn him. She said only that shame ran in families like Blue Eyes, and some people came by it honest. Then she talked about Harold. The reporter's pen slowed on the page, the way pens do when something true is being said instead of something useful. 36 years alone, Marlene said, and never once thought the debt was something a bank could measure. When the reporter finally asked about the bank officer by name, the kitchen went quiet enough to hear the clock above the stove, the same clock that had marked 40 years of milkings before the herd shrank to 40 head, and one woman's stubborn clockwork devotion. Marlene answered without heat. Facts, she said, speak louder than anger ever has, and she'd let the paper do the speaking for her. Outside, the president checked his watch. 5 days now. Somewhere in Black Ridge, a man was still filing paperwork that assumed no one was counting the days but him. The reporter left with a full notebook and a promise that the story would run before the auction date, not after. That detail mattered more than any other sentence spoken in that kitchen. Marlene walked her to the car, past the barn where 3 men were replacing rotted siding board by board, and stood a long moment with her hand on the door before saying anything at all. You'll spell his name right, she said. Harold's, 2 L's, 1 D. The reporter said she would. Back inside, the president found the cedar box still sitting where he'd left it on the sideboard, the 1974 letter tucked beneath a folded dish towel, as if Marlene had wanted it near, but not looked at directly. He didn't touch it. Some things earned their rest. That afternoon, the milking parlor came alive again for the first time in longer than anyone but Marlene could say. The equipment had been flushed, the lines pressure tested, a new gasket seated where the old one had perished into something like leather left too long in the sun. 40 cows moved through in loose, unhurried order, and the sound of the vacuum pump, that steady mechanical breathing, filled the barn the way it must have filled it decades earlier, when there'd been 200 head and a husband alive to run the machine. Marlene stood at the rail and watched it work. She did not say much. She rested one hand flat against a support post, the wood silvered and split with age, and closed her eyes for exactly as long as it took the first cow to clear the stall. The youngest patched member noticed. He always did. He'd learned by now that her stillness carried more weight than her words, that a closed eye and a flat palm against old wood was its own kind of sentence, unspoken but complete. Sounds right, she said finally, opening her eyes. Sounds like it used to. He nodded, said nothing, and went back to coiling a length of hose that didn't need coiling. By evening, the barn cats came out for their dish, exactly on schedule, and Marlene fed them exactly as she always had, crouched with her knees complaining, murmuring names that meant nothing to anyone but her and the cats. The president watched from the porch steps, turning the days over in his mind, like a man counting coins he wasn't sure would be enough. 5 days until the auction. 2, if the paper ran early. He thought of the bank officer somewhere across town, filing his forms in the particular quiet of a man who believed silence was the same thing as certainty. It wasn't, not anymore, though the man filing them didn't know that yet. The reporter came on the seventh day, as promised, in a sedan the color of weak coffee, and she stood at the edge of the yard for a long moment before she got out, as if she needed to confirm the address twice against a handwritten note on her dashboard. She was younger than the president expected, maybe 30, with a notebook already worn soft at the corners and a camera slung low across her body, like something she'd forgotten she was carrying. She introduced herself with a handshake that was firmer than her frame suggested, and she did not smile the way people smile when they want something. She looked instead, first at the barn's new tin roof catching the low sun, then at the row of motorcycles parked along the fence line, like a fence of their own, then at the woman standing on the porch with her hands folded in her apron, the way she must have stood for 50 years waiting on weather or workers or bad news. "Mrs. Voss," the reporter said, "I understand you've had some help this week." "I understand you've had some questions," Marlene said, and there was no bite in it, only the same flatness she used for everything, the voice of a woman who had long since stopped wasting words on softening. The reporter's questions were careful ones. She asked about Harold. She asked about 1988, about the 200 cows that had become 40, about the years alone, with no one to call but the vet and the man who fixed the tractor. She wrote without looking down at her hand, the way people do when they've trained themselves not to miss anything spoken, while getting it all spoken to paper. When she asked about the notice, Marlene's jaw set, and for a moment the president thought she might refuse to answer, might close the door on the whole thing, the way she'd tried to close it from the start. But she only looked past the reporter, toward the barn, toward the cats sunning themselves near the milk house. "I didn't ask for help," she said. "I still don't know that I deserve it more than the next woman losing her land to a man with a briefcase." The reporter looked up from her notebook. "Do you think he's counting on that? People believing they don't deserve it?" Marlene didn't answer right away. She looked at the president instead, a long, unreadable look, the kind she'd been giving him all week, as though she were still deciding what to make of 47 strangers rebuilding a fence line for a woman who owed them nothing. "I think," she said finally, "he's counting on nobody asking the question at all." The reporter wrote that down word for word, and closed her notebook, and looked toward the road as if she could already see the presses turning. The article ran on a Thursday, above the fold, with a photograph of the hand-painted sign and 40 cows in a field that had been mud 11 days earlier. The headline did not use the word scheme. It used the word pattern, which the lawyer said was better, because pattern was a word that made other people start checking their own mailboxes. By Friday morning, the clubhouse phone was ringing with numbers from 3 counties over. A man in Miller's Gap said his mother had gotten a notice in March with a window that closed before she understood what it meant. A woman outside Cedar Fork said her father had signed something he thought was a routine refinancing form, and the bank officer's name was on the bottom of it in the same careful, unhurried hand. The president did not answer most of the calls himself. He let the lawyer take them, one at a time, writing dates and names on a legal pad that was filling faster than she could keep the margins straight. She did not say anything about the size of what she was seeing. She did not have to. Her face did the saying for her, the way it had the first night at the kitchen table, when she'd read 9 days as though the number itself were an accusation. The regional office issued no statement that Friday. A silence has its own weather, and this one sat over the county like the heat that hadn't broken since the second week of the work, thick and waiting. On the farm, the work went on as if none of it were happening, because that was the only way Marlene knew how to hold a day together. She fed the cats at 6. She set Harold's boots by the door at night, as if he might still be tracking mud through the kitchen. The youngest patched member noticed she'd started leaving the porch light on until well past dark, longer than she needed to see the cats safely fed, and he did not ask her why, because he'd learned by then that some habits were not questions waiting to be answered. The reporter called again Saturday, her voice quicker than before. She said the paper had gotten a call from someone identifying himself as legal counsel for the bank, asking for a correction that never specified what needed correcting. She said her editor had laughed, actually laughed, and told her to keep writing. Sunday the sky stayed white and merciless, the kind of white that made the barn's red paint look like a wound. The auction date was 2 days off now, close enough that the club stopped saying the number out loud, as if naming it might hurry it forward. The president stood at the fence line that evening, watching the herd move slow and unbothered across the field they'd saved, and understood that whatever was coming next would not be decided by 9 days of labor. It would be decided by whether anyone with power was still willing to be embarrassed. Monday morning came in gray and close, the humidity pressing down on Black Ridge like a hand on the back of the neck, and the courier hit the doorsteps and gas station racks with the bank officer's name printed in full for the first time, not as a source, not as a spokesman, but as the subject of 4 paragraphs describing parcels acquired, notices filed, and a pattern a state banking examiner would later call, when finally asked, worth looking into. The witness read it twice at the kitchen table, while Marlene poured coffee she did not drink, her hand steady, in a way that made the president, watching from the doorway, think of a woman bracing for weather rather than a woman celebrating. By noon, the phone at the regional branch had reportedly stopped ringing with customers and started ringing with reporters from 2 counties over, a fact relayed to the club not by the bank but by the mechanic's cousin, who did the branch's landscaping and had never in 11 years seen the manager leave before 5. The bank officer himself was not seen in town that day. His truck was gone from its usual spot behind the building. Someone said Amarillo. Someone said nowhere, said he was upstairs the whole time with the blinds drawn, which seemed more likely to anyone who had watched a man's certainty curdle in real time over 9 days and understood that shame, when it finally arrives, prefers a closed room. The lawyer called at 4 with her voice pitched careful and even, the voice of someone who had learned not to promise what she could not yet deliver. She said the bank's counsel had reached out asking to schedule a call for Tuesday morning. She said she'd told them Tuesday was fine, though privately she wondered aloud to the sergeant-at-arms whether Tuesday would come soon enough, since the auction sat scheduled for Wednesday at 10, and paperwork, unlike shame, did not move on anyone's conscience. The president did not sleep well that night. He sat on the porch steps long after the house had gone dark behind him, the cedar box letter folded back into his jacket pocket, where it had ridden for 9 days like a second heartbeat, and he thought about his mother's handwriting, about a widow feeding strangers off a porch decades before he was born, about how some debts outlive the people who incur them, and land, eventually, on someone who never signed for anything. Above the barn, the swallows cut low against a sky gone the color of a bruise healing, and somewhere behind him the porch light clicked on, early again, though it was not yet fully dark, as if she meant to be ready for whatever arrived next before it had the decency to knock. The call came Tuesday at 9:14 in the morning, and it did not last long. The lawyer stood in the gravel yard with her phone pressed to her ear, and the men stopped what they were doing without being told to, hammers set down mid-swing, a wheelbarrow left tilted on its side, because there is a stillness that spreads through working men when they sense a verdict arriving. She listened. She said, "I understand," twice, and then she said nothing at all, for almost a full minute, and then she lowered the phone and looked at the porch where the old woman stood with one hand on the rail. "They're withdrawing the notice," she said. "New terms. 20 years. Fixed." Nobody cheered. It was not that kind of morning. The president watched her take it the way she took most things, quietly, her jaw working once, her eyes going past all of them to the barn roof that no longer leaked, to the fence line standing straight for the first time in a decade, to the sign at the end of the drive that someone had repainted 3 days earlier without asking, Vos Deri Est. 1951 in the same lettering Harold had used, or close enough that she hadn't said a word when she saw it, only nodded once and gone back inside. The courier ran the story that Thursday, above the fold, with a photograph of the barn and the cows and 40-some men who had not wanted their faces printed, but had not stopped it either. The bank's regional office issued a statement 2 days after that, using words like oversight and regret, words that meant nothing and everything, and the officer was not seen in Black Ridge again. They left on a Sunday, the whole column of them pulling out down the gravel road in the low gold light that comes only at the far end of August, engines catching one after another until the sound of it rolled off the ridge like something arriving instead of leaving. She stood on the porch to see them off, Harold's boots by the door behind her, the barn cats fed on schedule, the milking done an hour before with equipment that ran clean and quiet for the first time in years. The president was last to mount up. She raised a hand, not quite a wave, and said the thing he would carry the rest of his life folded next to the letter. 36 years, she said, and nobody once stopped to see if I was still standing here. Then she smiled, small and dry. Come back sometime, I'll have coffee. They did. Every season after, someone rode out to check the fences, unasked, unpaid, the way debts get settled that were never written down.